Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon? Still almost afternoon. I was told to just go ahead and introduce myself because I'm not a stranger to this organization. So if you don't know me, I'm Ted Struley. I'm the editor of the Journal Record. Myrna said I could drag out my bio as long as I wanted to, and that's all you're getting. That's it. I will start with our guiding principle for the day, which I think should be collaboration. And I am particularly struck because of today's speaker by the first point as an achievement of common goals through the promotion of ethical, mutually beneficial relationships. And as you'll learn in just a moment, I think if we could have selected a speaker who is a pro at mutually beneficial ethical relationships, it's our guest today. I was thinking the other day about all the things that we wanted to be that we ended up not being. And I have a 4-year-old at home who announced to us the other day that he wants to be a fireman, a policeman, an astronaut, and a lawyer. And those are all great aspirations. You know, he's only 4, he's got a long time, but those are pretty diverse fields to try to pack into one lifetime. I think in his mind he's going to do them all at once. So our guest today, Dr. Stephen Prescott, is the CEO of OMRF, and he has a long list of spectacular achievements that I'll highlight a couple of in just a moment. His short list of non-spectacular achievements was his desire to be a professional baseball player, which, as you can tell by his current uniform and career, didn't really pan out for him. And he did get further along the path than most of us. He was invited to a very small tryout with the New York Mets that involved about 40 people, and I'm not telling tales out of school because by his own description, he got to that tryout and realized very quickly that of the 40, he was going to be number 40. And that was pretty much the end of the baseball career. Fortunately, he discovered that he had some talents in some other areas. We will not hold against him that he is a native of Texas. We also won't hold against him that he's a graduate of Texas A&M. It could have been the other school, it could be worse. And we won't even hold against him that he went to medical school at Baylor. We like him anyway. He's overcome most of those deficiencies, fortunately. And since 2006, when he became the 9th president at OMRF, replacing Don Capra, he has raised more than $90 million for that institution. And perhaps his most noticeable achievement is that huge new 189,000 square foot tower that is LEED Gold certified that they built, where they do some really extraordinary MS research with thousands of patients each year. The list of Dr. Prescott's accomplishments is lengthy. He was on the faculty at the University of Utah. He has a story about Utah, which he told me when I first met him back in 2006. He's going to share it with you, so I won't ruin that. But when I think of OMRF and I think of raising $90 million so that the people in that building can do the kinds of things that we all dream about, which is not necessarily being a fireman, policeman, astronaut, and lawyer, but curing cancer, curing MS, making the strides that we all hope to see accomplished in our lifetime or our children's lifetime. Much of that goes back in this city to Dr. Stephen Prescott, and I will let him take the microphone from there.
Thanks, Ted. And I'm going to talk later a little bit more about the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation, and I'll have one correction there, and you'll see that any success there is not due to me, but to the outstanding team that we've assembled there, and I'll tell you who some of them are at that time. But I'm going to start now, since this is an ethics society, and I was given a task of talking about ethics. I'm going to start with a story, the one that Ted alluded to. I'm looking around, trying to find people my age, and there are probably a couple in here. Most of you are considerably younger. So I'm going to have to start with a history lesson, because this story takes place in the fall of 1976. I hope that the lessons that come from it will be applicable to today and to the future. But I know for some of you who weren't born then, or some of you weren't paying attention to the news in 1976. But in 1976, there had been a moratorium for 10 years that prevented the death penalty. There were no executions in the United States of America for the 10 years preceding that. This had come with a court case in the Supreme Court. But a new case had come along and changed that, removed that prohibition so that now the death penalty could be carried out again in '76. At about the same time, a young drifter, he's in his mid-30s, named Gary Gilmore, moved to a little town in Utah just south of Salt Lake City, where I lived at the time. And Mr. Gilmore had spent almost half of his life in prison or in juvenile facilities, and was just a flat-out sociopath. I mean, this guy was a bad, bad guy. And on 2 successive nights, he killed young men in cold blood. One was a motel clerk, and the other was a clerk in a convenience store, and he robbed them for $30 or something like that, and just shot them just for the heck of it. Both of them had wives and young children. It was a real horrible story. He was caught immediately, basically confessed. And he was such an odd guy that during the course of that, then he just said, they gave him the death penalty. The jury was out for 15 minutes or something, gave him the death penalty, and then he said, no appeal, and refused it. And so this went on for a few months, but not very long by death penalty standards. Went on for a few months, and he systematically refused to let anybody appeal. Some of his family tried to launch one. A group of ministers and others tried to do them. People from all over the world tried to do this. And as the date got closer, there was a date set in the fall. The murders happened in January. This all happened pretty fast. He was going to be executed in either, I believe, late November was the first date that was set. As the date got closer, groups from all over the world, literally all over the world, came to Salt Lake City trying to put together petitions, various ways, trying to find standing, is that the word, counselor? Some basis that they could make this appeal. And Gilmore, who was actually very, very smart, he had a measured IQ of over 130. He would periodically have these press conferences, and he said, I want all those reverends and rabbis to butt out of my business. So they didn't want any appeals, but one succeeded, and a stay of execution came up. And that was on, I believe, November the 15th or something like that. Take a little pause from the Gary Gilmore story now. Now at that time, I'd gone to Baylor College of Medicine, which isn't part of that green and gold school any longer. It was separate. And I was at the end of my clinical training, like internship residency, and again, some of you will know this, but there's kind of an odd type of job where, as one of the senior trainees, I was in charge of who got admitted to the university hospital that day. Basically, I had to give a thumbs up for a person to come in through the emergency room or one of the clinics to have a bed in the hospital. And so that was my job that day. And I was, this was in 1976, remember, no cell phones, no internet, no texting, and so we found people in the hospital by paging overhead, right? Now, because I was in charge today, I actually had a beeper, which is a very sophisticated thing to have in those days, right? It didn't have any text messages, it buzzed, and I had to go phone somewhere, right? I had to go phone the operator, who then, that's the house. So it buzzed, and I would call it, and it was one of my subordinates who was working in the emergency room said, hey, Steve, you better get down here. They're bringing in Gary Gilmore. I said, what are you talking about? Remember the day before a stay of execution had been put down by some court. Well, he was angry because he didn't want that, so he had attempted suicide. It had been planned, and he had had his girlfriend smuggle in barbiturates, and they had a suicide pact. She took hers at home, and he took his in the prison. He was found in his cell, he brought him. Now, I didn't know that at the time, of course. I just said, oh yeah, nice try, funny joke, ha ha, hung up the phone. Buzzed again. By now I was getting a little panicky. No, you better get down here right now, man. So I walked down to the emergency room, and about that time, pandemonium broke out in the emergency room. The doors burst open. I was kind of in the hallway near one of the sort of operating rooms. The doors just exploded. There are police everywhere with shotguns and machine guns and pushing people around, and there's a stretcher, and there are emergency technicians. And then right behind them is this horde of news people. 1976, the first time there's going to be a death, an execution in over 10 years. It's gotten publicity all over the world, and they were all there because the execution was supposed to be just in a couple of days. So suddenly we're overwhelmed. All this, so into the emergency room, and sure enough, he was basically dead. Didn't breathe, blew, heart rate was almost indetectable. So colleague and I put a tube in his trachea, an endotracheal tube, resuscitated him, did all this stuff, gave him medications, and then sort of got him back, breathing, blood pressure was okay, and then took him off to the intensive care unit. So it was kind of a dramatic day. Not your average day on call at the University of Utah Hospital. So we made it through the night. He was awakened the next morning. And I don't know if there are other physicians or nurses or people in the room, but some of you had the experience that if you take care of a patient who truly intended to commit suicide. Now, sometimes people make gestures of suicide. They don't really want it to work, but people who really haven't tried to die, they're not grateful when they wake up. Now, usually when you save somebody's life, you save them a heart attack, whatever, you're used to a little bit of gratitude. A thank you from the family, maybe a note, bottle of wine, whatever. But suicide, real suicide attempts usually are not grateful. They're still depressed, and they don't want to be here, and so they don't give you any credit for having saved their life. So Mr. Gilmore was in that category. On top of which, he was a flat-out sociopath, right? So he was angry at us, and he would spit at the nurses and try to bite them. We had him restrained, of course, all his limbs, and there was a cop in the room and everything like that. But he was really an unpleasant person. Can we get that slide? Thank you. So now I'm going to use that as a basis to talk about some ethical questions that came up in this. And so I'd say the first one that came up, that's a picture of Mr. Gilmore waiting for his date with the executioner. So the first thing that comes up, since he was very angry at me, how dare I do this to him? Why didn't I get permission to treat him? Think about this. When you go to a physician's office, you sign a form. Probably don't read it, but it says that they've got permission to do things to you, right? When you go to get an operation at the hospital, you sign a form. It has a lot of things that they agree to. Why? We can come back and talk about these later. You can try to answer now. This is the part where I'm going to ask a question. Why do they make you sign that? If they don't, what physicians or nurses or others will do to you in office could be considered assault and battery, right? I shoved a tube down this guy's throat without his permission, right? I stuck him with needles. I did all kinds of things. Well, if I came out and did that to one of you, we'd call the police, right? This guy's attacking me, right? So that's the legal rationale for why you sign that permission. You give them permission to assault you, right? You hope under the right circumstances, right? And with a better outcome than usual, right? So that's the logic of it. Okay, so why didn't I have to get permission from Gary Gilmore? I would have to get permission from you to do an operation on you. Well, there are two reasons in this case. So the sort of prevailing reason with him was that Mr. Gilmore no longer had authority over his own person because he was a prisoner of the state of Utah. So they owned him, basically. And those prison guards who brought him into the emergency room, they gave me permission. I mean, de facto, right? They're transferring their authority over him to me. So now I had control of him once that happened. But there's another broader and more important principle here, and that's it's one that you will experience, maybe, I hope not personally, but in your life with loved ones or friends or colleagues at work. And that is, what if somebody has an emergency, an automobile wreck, or a heart attack out here in the lobby, or whatever, And if there are medically trained people around, or even if you as a first aid volunteer or whatever, go help them, you're allowed to do that in an emergent situation even without their permission, because they may be unconscious, right? So, and that's probably the most compelling time to go do that, because that's the people at most risk. So there is a principle, a legal and ethical principle, that if you're acting on behalf of the patient, you're trying to save their life, you're trying to do something good for them, you don't have to get that permission in advance. You can have sort of emergency implied permission to do that. So it was another basis on which I could have had the right to treat Mr. Gilmore. That the police couldn't come get me for assaulting him, right? Even though he still wasn't happy about the fact that I did it, right? So I'd like to come back and revisit this one. You can imagine, I think there are some, Shannon told me I had to try to make parallels in the broader business world. I think there's some here, kind of, depends a little bit. We have some attorneys who can tell me about the contractual elements. I think this is sort of analogy I would make is, probably have some people in the oil and gas business. I think I saw Devon, Sandridge, Devon, right? If you can't just go on somebody's land and drill a well, right? You have to actually get permission, right? And go through and sign all these documents. But if you saw something happening there that was clearly an emergency and you were clearly acting in an altruistic way, you could do that. You could violate the property right and go on that property to try to help somebody, and you wouldn't be in any trouble. Now, you couldn't drill an oil well while you were there, but you could do it quickly, right? You could go save somebody or help them pull a truck out of a ditch or something like that, right? So I think there's some sort of analogies in the world of contracts and maybe implied contracts at times. And I'll keep trying to make connections to a broader business world. You can tell me whether I succeeded or not later on. Okay. Well, so Mr. Gilmore woke up by this time, and he couldn't have the police come get me for mistreating him. But this leads to another really good idea. So we've got somebody, we don't have to worry about this consent business. We got the lawyers out of it. No lawyers involved in this, no documents that we have to sign. Why aren't these the perfect lab rats right here, right? So we talk about, when I talk about OMRF later on, we'll talk about how we do a lot of work with mice and genetically engineered mice, but there's, mice aren't humans, no matter how much we try to make it like a human disease or not. And we need always to test new medications or new diagnostics. We need to test them in human beings. And I'll tell you later, we do that at OMRF. We have clinical trials, clinical studies with patients that give us permission for that. Well, it'd be a whole lot easier if we just used prisoners, right? Because I told you, they no longer have authority over themselves. We can just take over. So why don't we do that? Immoral, somebody says. Why? They're prisoners, for crying out loud. They did something bad, they're in prison. So, well, from an ethical point of view, this actually goes back, but there's a long-standing tradition in wars, of course. When you get captives, you can do whatever you want with them. I mean, there goes back during the Second World War, the Japanese did live vivisection on prisoners of war, just to see how things worked, The Nazis, of course, did horrific experiments on prisoners of war and other people. So it really came from this idea of trying to standardize norms of how one should treat prisoners, really in a wartime setting, and then it got expanded to other prisoners. And it came out of the trials at Nuremberg, were the first sort of codified set of ethics that applied to this. And now there are many successors to this that have become more and more sophisticated to talk about how medical research should be conducted. And in almost every case, the drivers for another round of conferences and consensus agreements and so forth were through some, what appears currently in retrospect were unethical or sometimes even just egregious behavior of not seeking consent from people who were mentally unable to consent. So not just prisoners who'd done something, but people with mental handicaps, and they would do experiments on them. They can't give consent, so just do it anyway. Well, that, of course, is no longer accepted. So an absolute key part of consent to participate in something is that you have to be fully informed. You have to understand what's being proposed. If I ask you to participate in a trial of a new medication for rheumatoid arthritis, which might happen if you came to OMRF, or for multiple sclerosis, or for lupus erythematosus, we would be obliged to tell you in detail why that particular study was being done, why that particular medication was being tested. I mean, what's the rationale for it? I mean, why do we think it might work? What are the potential side effects? How likely are those side effects? What happens if I have a side effect? In as much detail as you want. And you have the right to revoke your permission at any time you want. Right? So, okay, I no longer want to be part of this. I'm done. At any time, and we have to say, fine, we're done. So it's very, very detailed. And part of that is that there can't be any coercion. Now, one of the things we pay attention about in the issue of coercion is we run research clinics. So we're not a medical business, if you will, not like a hospital or a clinic where you can come get checkups. Ours clinics are all run with the purpose of doing research, but we don't require people to be in a research project because we think that would be coercive. If they get referred to us, they usually come to us because they want to be in a project, they've heard about it, and we offer them that opportunity. We go through this detailed description, but we don't require it. If they say, no, I'm not going to do that, but I'd sure like to be a patient here, we would say yes. Right? So, or if they start in a project and then withdraw, we don't throw them out of the clinic, right? Because if we required it, it would be coercive, right? Because we've got this outstanding physicians, they want to come there, and we can't say the price of coming here is you have to be in this trial. Right? So we're very sensitive now to this issue of coercion, and with prisoners, it's a really a touch point. In fact, today, experiments on prisoners is probably the hardest group. Maybe the mentally incapable, but prisoners are probably of a large group of the ones. This is a pretty recent innovation. When I was in medical school in Houston, I was an assistant on a project that was held at a small prison just outside of Houston. As a low security prison, kind of a work farm type place. And we were, literally I was working with a professor on a cure for the common cold. And we'd go out there and they had these prisoners who volunteered. They said they signed, we did consent forms. We had all about what we're doing. We're going to put some virus in your nose, spray it back in your nose, and every day for a week we're going to check secretions and we'll draw blood and so forth, and we'll give you a pill or not. So it was all explained, and I think we paid them like $5 a week or something like that into their commissary account so they could buy cigarettes and candy or whatever. And we thought we were behaving ethically, and I think we did, and so forth. But people, they were very anxious to sign up. I mean, we were the big show when we were out there, because these people are desperate for any kind of contact with the outside world, and to be, a bunch of young doctors are coming in and talk to me and examine me. It made for a good day, even though we were spraying virus in their nose. But but that would be almost impossible to do today, to go to a prison and do that experiment. Now we have to go to a university and ask students to sign up, right? Or some such place, and probably pay them $10 instead of $5. But yeah, so it's very, very hard now, and even in 1976, it would not have been an appropriate thing for me to say, well, while we got him here, let's just try out something else on Mr. Gilmore. I know some of you are thinking we should have tried, but that would not have been the right thing to do. Okay, I can't think of an analogy to this type of informed consent in business. And I should have made the explicit distinction here. And it's an important thing for physicians and nurses and other healthcare workers to make this distinction. The consent to treat that I talked about before is entirely different from a consent to participate in a research project. And in fact, we encourage our staff to use different words. When you're talking about this person as participating in your trial, you refer to them as a research subject. It's kind of impersonal and pretentious. And now when you're over here as your patient, that's a patient, right? And there are different ethical standards applied to them, right? And what you can do with information, for example, and so forth are different. Maybe the same person, but they're in two categories. And it's helpful to think about it that way to make sure that people are following the highest standards ethically. Okay, well, back to the story of Mr. Gilmore. It was a great success medically. We had him in the intensive care unit for a couple of days, but we managed to get he had a bad pneumonia. We got that all treated and so forth. And so the culminating part of this great success was we sent him back to the prison. So when that happened, this is the question I got from a lot of my friends. Right? Now, fortunately, remember 1976, no internet, no email, no Twitter, no text messaging or whatever. So had it been today, I would have gotten thousands of messages from all over the world. As it was, I only got hundreds from friends around the country who'd phone me or whatever. And they broke into two categories. One, why didn't you just go ahead and kill the blank, 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 and save everybody all the time and expense and trouble and so forth and so on. The others were, how on earth can you justify sending him back to the prison since you know they're just going to kill him? All right? So, I mean, I couldn't win. This was a no-win situation. Right? Well, I mean, obviously, to the first one, why didn't I just kill him? Well, people were watching. No, I mean, that was a joke. Yeah, but seriously, I mean, obviously, I can't be judge and executioner and so forth and so on. And obviously, to the second question, why on earth are they sending him back to the prison? Well, they had the guns, right? They were going to take him to the prison. They owned him, not me, right? So I didn't have any role in the bigger proceedings, right? My role was this one. I was just on the stage briefly in this whole process. Now, but the important thing to think about here is, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit, it's in the lessons from today, since this is get credits today. If you listen to the whole time, you get a credit or something. All right, okay. So the point to make here is that the ethical point underlying this now has to do with the role of physicians in execution. So it's a little bit of a stretch, I realize, since I didn't have any role in execution. But when he went back to the prison, Mr. Gilmore had his choice of how to die. At that time in Utah, there were two routes. One is that you could be hanged with an old-fashioned rope and a noose. And he decided against that because he thought it was too unpredictable and that it might not snap his neck and kill him instantly, that he might choke him to death, and it might be a sort of a painful and protracted death. He said, no thanks. His other option was death by firing squad. And I don't remember the exact number, but I think it was 6 persons. And I think, they had, one of the rifles doesn't have a cartridge in it, so you don't know for sure who killed them and so forth and so on. But they had lots of volunteers for this in Utah, and so that's what he chose. Right? And so obviously in that kind of setting, there really isn't a role for a physician other than maybe to declare the person dead. But I'm going to say, so I talk about this a little bit because it's been much in the news around here, right? About the medical connections to the death penalty and physicians and botched executions, quotes, whatever. And not just here, but in others as well, as more modern types of death penalty have been carried out. Let me remind everybody, I think probably most people know it, that every medical society of every flavor, whether it's the American Medical Society, a general one, or a different specialist or whatever, are in complete agreement that physicians should have nothing to do with executions. Nothing. The stance is absolutely predictable. All of them say no role, physicians cannot be involved. In fact, most of them say physicians can't even declare the patient dead, or the subject dead, not the patient. They can confirm that they're dead after someone else has declared a time of death. They can't give the injections, they can't mix the drugs, they can't give advice on what drugs, so forth and so on. This is according to all these societies in the ethical sense. Now there's a little bit of a problem. I forget, won't get these numbers exactly right, but something like 36 states have death penalty, maybe more than that, and nearly all of them require medical personnel to be involved in, if they're doing a lethal injection, involve medical personnel. So to put in IV lines and to mix the drugs and so forth and so on. It's usually not too specific, but there's actually been litigation between medical societies that happened in North Carolina and in the prison system of the state when they were just directly opposed to each other. The medical society saying we're going to suspend people's privileges or we're going to pull their license order if they do it. Right? So certainly physicians have done it, and there generally hasn't been any kind of explicit penalty, but if it's known who they are, they're at high risk of being kicked out of whatever society for whatever that may have no meaning to them, but they would be that. But the point is clear that it's uniform. This isn't a controversial issue in medicine. It is judged to be unethical for a physician to participate in an execution. Why? Is it because all physicians, all medical societies are against the death penalty? Not particularly. Any question? It goes back to the very first thing we talked about. The presumption should be that a physician is acting in the interest of the patient, trying to save their life, trying to do what's right for them. And if you say, well, except for now and then, right? That little gray area over there begins to make people suspicious, a loss of trust, a loss of the sort of moral imperative about why you're doing these things, right? Yes, you can carve out a little case about why this is different, this and the other, but that's the problem. If you start carving out pieces, they're going to be more and more and more, and it'll crumble. The same stance has been taken for other types of physician intervening in death. So like remember the Dr. Kevorkian that would actually go administer drugs to end the life of people with terminal illnesses. Right? And then, of course, there are various gradations of this. What about if a physician writes a prescription, doesn't actually give you the medication, but she knows that that medication, if taken that way, will kill you, right? So, I mean, it's sort of assisted suicide, that's called, and so forth. So, again, medical societies are unanimously, just overwhelmingly opposed to that. Now, what about something like hospice or easing the end of life? I mean, there's a nuance here, but again, most society, or virtually all societies, support that. I mean, that you should find ways to ease suffering. I mean, that is a traditional role of a physician or nurse or healthcare worker, ease suffering, right? And do we know that sometimes that easing suffering may come to a calibration that leads to an earlier death than would have happened otherwise? Well, of course, that happens. If you're giving morphine to relieve pain, it may suppress breathing and they may die 3 hours sooner than they would have otherwise. But the key here is the intention and how you behave. If you just write a prescription, say, here, a bunch of morphine, go take it, that doesn't qualify. Right? If you're there attending the patient, supervising how much they're getting, not intentionally overdosing them to death, that's caring for the patient. So in my mind, these are completely linked. It doesn't always strike everybody that whether you're there at an execution at the prison and a terminally ill patient, but the same ethical concept underlies the stance of these medical societies. All right, next slide. Oh, I do that, sorry. Why did some idiot change the slide? Oh. Well, we got other criticism. Remember I told you that there was just this incredible flood of the press. I mean, it was one of the biggest events of the decade. Well, I guess Watergate was bigger, but it was, it was sort of the next big thing after Watergate, and there were press and reporters from all over the world, including #1 on the hit parade as far as being obnoxious, in my opinion, was a bright young rising star from Good Morning America by the name of Geraldo Rivera. Who was there, and he was on television around the clock during this time. And the reporters were much more clever than any of the hospital staff and the physicians there, the police, whatever, because nobody had any experience with dealing with the storm of media that came like this. So the hospital had no way to even keep people that weren't supposed to be on the ward out of the ward. The ICU kind of got secured pretty because it's smaller, but the whole ward, the floor, I mean, we had to transport patients in public elevators. That's just the way it was in those days, and we couldn't control them. There was no way to control the elevators. So the reporters figured that out, and they would just write them all day long, day after day, hoping that we'd take Mr. Gilmore down to X-ray or something like that. And if you did, there'd be a photographer for Time magazine ready to shoot pictures of him on a stretcher or whatever. My intern that was assigned to the case was an avid photographer, and he walked on an elevator, and they immediately figured out who the staff was taking care of him. This guy's name was Mike Melendez, and Mike was an amateur photographer. He had on his name tag, and he walked on. He saw a guy with thousands of dollars of camera gear hanging around. Oh, we were making really huge salaries. Mike was probably making about $4,800 a year, and he sees like $10,000 worth of cameras hanging on this guy's neck, and he said, "Oh, is that a Nikon?" And the guy pulled it off, one of like 3 cameras, handed him this expensive Nikon camera, or what kind of camera, with lenses and all, and $500 in cash. And he said, "Bring this back with a fully exposed roll of film, and I'll give you another $500." somebody's making $5,000 a year, it's a pretty good offer, right? But he turned him down. But I mean, they were trying everything to get photographs, to get personal stories about Mr. Gilmore, and we were constantly harangued with, public's right to know, everybody in the world wants to know about this, and so forth and so on. But fortunately, the hospital leadership and we got together and almost immediately said, what's our stance going to be? And it became, our stance was, we didn't sell him anything. Right? Now the prison could, because remember, going back, it's a little bit odd. It's not like if you're in the hospital, but actually the prison owned him, right? So they could make statements and answer questions, but we weren't going to. Right? We told them nothing, right? In spite of a lot of heat about what that was. This is relevant today. We just had a discussion about HIPAA in this section. So it's in almost all of your businesses, HIPAA is going to be important to you. I'll guarantee you. You may not know it yet unless you're in the HR department or somewhere, but HIPAA is going to be a reality in your life. The Health Information, Health Portability and Accountability Act. But the Act had to do with a lot of other things about being able to take insurance from one place to another. But the part that's important for employers, but also for hospitals, physicians, nurses, any health workers, or is it really detailed information about how you protect patients' privacy and medical records, what constitutes protected information, individual information, and so forth. It's quite detailed, but again, the principle is it's nobody else's business what your healthcare record is. You gave it to a physician or a nurse or another healthcare worker under conditions of confidentiality, going back to that very first ethical principle, that they are acting on your behalf, right? That's why you tell them these things about you, how much you drink, so forth and so on, that you may not want people to know in general. But you need to tell them if you want to get the best health care. So that's the idea behind this, that there is information in there that was given on a certain basis, and it's not, or should not be available for just random looking and gossiping and chit-chat around the water cooler of the office or the table here. So you're going to see this more and more, but it's about the same idea about who should have the right to know something about a health issue, whether it's a notorious criminal being treated in a hospital or your latest checkup at the doctor. And the rules really are going to be pretty much the same, and they're very stringent now, and pretty bad penalties, right, if you if you violate these. Well, I'm going to go away from so the end of the story must be obvious. About 6 weeks later, Mr. Gilmore was shot to death. So that's the end of ethics lessons based on Gary Gilmore. So now, for something entirely different. As you can tell already, I'm not an ethicist day by day. I'd have been long since gone, right, with this kind of approach. But let me tell you a little bit about the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation. Sometimes people tell me you're the best kept secret in Oklahoma. We don't intend to be a secret. We would like for you to know all about us. And we're located over here on Northeast 13th as part of the Health Center complex. We're right just immediately west of the VA hospital, directly north of the Children's Hospital, the emergency entrance to the Children's Hospital. And we have a pretty substantial footprint there. We go all the way up to 16th Street. And Ted talked about our towers, the one with the vertical wind turbines on top. They look like a DNA helix. That's on purpose, which is our logo. And what we do there, I'm going to talk about it in more detail, but our name tells you what we do there, medical research. There are a number of interesting features. We actually were founded in 1946, and our original building was opened in 1950. It was on exactly where we are now. Our main building, where my office is the one that was opened in 1950. And we're one of the oldest independent research institutes in the country. We are an independent, private, nonprofit research institute. We have strong affiliations with OU Health Sciences. We have partnership with OSU's College of Veterinary Medicine, with Oklahoma City biology department, but we're not part of any university. We are an independent entity on our own. There are 91 or 2 of these around the country. Most are medical, but there are 2 that are not. One of the ones that's not is also in Oklahoma. It's the Noble Foundation down at Ardmore. They focus on agricultural research, but they are independent nonprofit. The others of the 90 or so, most do medical research. The Scripps Institute in La Jolla, the Salk Institute in La Jolla. Some of them are cancer centers like the Fred Hutchinson in Seattle, and so forth. But most of them are on the east and west coast. So relatively few in the central part of the country, and most of them are relatively new. We're in 1946. We're one of the very oldest of these, and we always brag about that because it's rare in Oklahoma that we can brag about being the oldest of anything, since it's the youngest state. But we are one of the oldest. It was started by a group of visionary businessmen and physicians back in 1946. It also is one of the very few of these research institutes that's not named for a single major donor. Scripps, Salk, Rockefeller, Stowers. So this one, right from the day one, was supported by the population of Oklahoma in general. Actually, the governor led a campaign at the time, and we had committees in all 77 counties to raise money. The goal for fundraising then was an outrageous sum of money. I always forget whether it was $2 million or $3 million, and it was considered just like this, ocean of money that was raised for it. It was a lot of money then, so very successful. And we've continued to this day to have statewide support and to be quite a little d democratic type organization. Well, our mission, I said the title is it. Our original motto is still our motto today: that more may live longer, healthier lives. That's got both a scientific element and a pragmatic element, and I'll talk to that a little bit. But we want to understand how diseases begin. That's the real investigative research part of it. And some people say, like, well, why don't you just skip that part since, work on diseases that are already there. I ought to have you raise hands. Who here has had a friend or a loved one or a coworker who got sick and it took a long time to make the diagnosis? Anybody have that experience? Yeah. Those of you who aren't thinking carefully enough, right? It's a very common problem. And why is that? Is it just because, incompetence? Well, sometimes maybe, but really it's usually because the difference between normal and disease is often a subtle one, and it comes gradually. So a normal cell doesn't turn into a cancer overnight. Bang, you went from completely normal to completely cancerous, right? It's a gradual thing. And the manifestations of that disease, whether it's a cancer or an infection or heart disease, whatever, can be gradual and they can be elusive. The symptoms can be hard to put together. And this is a very common problem. Some of the things we treat, like multiple sclerosis, it's a standard story by the time patients get to us that they've had some kind of problem for some longish period, and various tests were done and different physicians were seen and so forth, and finally the diagnosis was made. That's why we try to work on this, because if you understand the earliest things that happen that change from normal to disease, you're going to be much more able to design a diagnostic test that detects that change, that earliest change, and lets you diagnose it earlier and more accurately. It also gives you a leg up on trying to find treatments. Treatments that attack early in the disease process are going to be more effective than late. I mean, that's pretty much common sense, right? So we work a lot on how does it begin, including using, I told you earlier we use a lot of mice, but we use little transparent fish to do studies, of genetic studies. We use yeast sometimes because they give us insight into processes in the human body to find this where things go wrong. And then of course we do a lot of training of young researchers. New treatments for disease, we do a lot. We do clinical studies. Sometimes that's partnered with a big pharmaceutical company. Sometimes it's something we discovered. We've discovered 4 medications that have gone on to be available in the clinic today, all for life-threatening illnesses. And you say 4, how many? That's pretty good. How many do you think the Mayo Clinic? Mayo Clinic is 10 times our size. How many have they discovered that are on the market today? 0, you're right. Most big universities, most big research institutes have a 0 out there. So it's very unusual, and we're quite proud of the fact that we've taken this information, this very basic information, and converted it into something useful, that more may live longer, healthier lives. So our scientists and physicians are really dedicated to that proposition, not just understanding something so that you can brag to your scientific colleagues that I made a big discovery, but also something that can be converted into something useful for patients who are suffering. So we have 54 or so researchers who are group leaders. We have about 350, 400 people in labs, so a little over 500 total employees. But those 54, actually in business you'd call them group leaders. They essentially have P&L responsibility for their little area. And they pick what they work on. My job and the vice president of research is we decide what areas in general we're going into, and we assemble people in that area, and then they decide from there on. And these are our big areas of emphasis. Arthritis, we're among the world's leaders in studying these very severe forms of arthritis like lupus erythematosus, Sjogren's syndrome, rheumatoid arthritis. We have a vibrant cancer group that's being expanded right now, and we have a big strategic partnership with Stevenson Cancer Center. We don't treat any cancer patients or do clinical studies at OMRF, but those are partnered with Stevenson. Heart disease and strokes and blood clotting, abnormal blood clotting that leads those strokes has been a long-standing expertise at OMRF, and that's where 2 of those drugs I mentioned came out of that group. Ted introduced me, he said we have a big multiple sclerosis clinic that's actually in the new tower on the 1st floor, and we see about 3,000 MS patients per year, nearly all of whom are involved in some study, and we always have active enrollment in the latest new medications. Many of you know Dr. Jordan Tang invented a potential treatment for Alzheimer's disease. That was spun off to a company. We've actually spun off 14 startup companies, all originally founded in Oklahoma City. Many of them have now moved or merged or been acquired, but they began here, and he had a company that was going to commercialize this technology. It's now moved to California, and that really has to do with business issues. I should say, why would we sell it to a company or partner? I'll just tell you that the cost of going from the discovery stage where we typically play to a treatment that's on the market, on average, is about $1 billion. And it depends on the type of problem, but in Alzheimer's it's going to be at least $1 billion, maybe more, because the clinical trials are so big and so expensive. So we can't afford, obviously, to finance that, so we have to have a partner, and that means, of course, that we give up some control of that. And that's been partnered with a company out of Japan now who've committed about essentially $1 billion to the development, but they're in charge of it. I really can't tell you now exactly where that is, but it's in the clinical testing stage. And then finally, a thing called regenerative medicine, also called adult stem cells, where we can take cells from your body, fat cells or skin cells, and convert them into cartilage for a knee or a new pancreas or whatever. It's a very exciting part of medicine these days. And with that, reminded me that I should tell you that you too could have opportunity to support us. And of course you'd want to just because of the great work we do, but the legislature has recognized that our economic impact, particularly on these companies and all, is such that we have people who give us a gift can get an Oklahoma tax credit of up to a gift of $2,000, you get a 50% credit for $1,000, and it doesn't affect your federal deduction. So depending on tax brackets, you can give us $2,000 and it costs you $250, actually out of pocket. So we would encourage you to consider that when you're planning your gifts for this year. And I should say that because we do have a gift dedicated from a foundation that pays all of our core G&A expenses, my salary and Penny Voss's salary, all paid. So any gift you give us goes 100% to research. There's no tax on it for that. With that, I'm going to close. And how am I doing on time? We've got time for some questions. In fact, they have to ask questions if they want to get credit, right? I'm told I've got to talk at least 50 minutes. I said that's usually not a problem. But, right. So I'd be happy to open it back up to the ethical things about what did we learn from Mr. Gilmore about consent to treat or patient's rights or subject's rights in research or confidentiality of medical information. Any of those I'm happy to take questions, or even more fun, more questions about OMRF if you have them. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the death penalty with the chemicals that they use. Now, if the medical profession cannot give any help towards that area, how do they know what drugs to use?
The question was if medical professionals can't give advice about what drugs to use to carry out a death penalty, where do they get such information? Well, the original cocktail that was invented was actually invented in Oklahoma City. It was by the recommendation of an anesthesiologist in Oklahoma City, the one that's the basic cocktail that's used worldwide. So that person decided individually that he would participate, at least at that level, to give advice. And some physicians would say, well, I think it's appropriate for me to do that because they're going to execute people, so I want to try to make sure it works properly. So that, it's just a debate that would go on. The society says that's improper, but that's how it came about originally. And right now it's a big question, since all these societies are saying we're not going to help you even do that. We're not going to help tell you what would be better or worse. And so, but obviously there are a lot of smart people who can get on the internet and look at different drug dosages and so forth and so on. So I assume it'll be something along those lines. But there's an unresolved tension there that I agree. Yes, sir.
How do you, in the research groups, how do you see the ethics of giving a patient a placebo instead of medications?
If you couldn't hear, he asked in clinical research and a clinical trial of a new medication, what are the ethical issues surrounding some patients getting a placebo? It's a great question. In most clinical trials, and for most clinical problems, that's what's done. You take, if you've got new treatments, you take new treatment versus no treatment, but you don't tell them it's no treatment. You make a pill that's identical. It's got the same schedule and so forth, a placebo-controlled trial, and no one knows. The patient doesn't know, the research subject doesn't know, and the investigator doesn't know. That's called double blind. Everybody's blind to the treatment, and then you assess what happens. Right? And this is considered the most scientifically precise way to do the clinical trial, because your emotional bias doesn't get into it, and it's true of everybody. Patients want to get better. The physicians who are running the trial are only doing it because they're optimistic. They think this medicine might really work. So when you get that mixture, it's very common that the results are more optimistic than they really were. Okay, particularly if you're reporting on symptoms that are subjective, pain relief, various other things like that. If you can measure something, then those aren't as much of a problem. But it's created lots and lots of controversy, particularly in diseases where people are desperate. Alzheimer's disease. The grand answer of why to do it is, it's the most reliable way to avoid getting fooled, right? And losing time and money and so forth. It's easy to go down a route saying, boy, this drug looks like it is the answer and it's just great. You spend years and years and years and hundreds of millions of dollars and it's on the market. And now that everybody uses it, you discover it's no good at all. So you've just wasted all that time. But it's a tough issue, particularly, I mean, I had this experience this week of talking to a friend whose sister has just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and couldn't she get in some kind of treatment plan with the newest treatments that didn't involve randomization? And the answer is no, not for the most promising drugs. But you got a 50-50 chance. In cancer, it's different. So in cancer studies, typically the cancer trials are done as best existing therapy and best existing therapy plus the new therapy. So, for example, we've invented a compound that we believe is likely to help in brain tumors. And so we don't displace any treatment, it gets added on to the treatment. And so it's a little bit different style. And there's a lot of discussion now, because this process has become so conservative, so risk averse, trying to prevent side effects and others, that there's a lot of criticism of this randomized double-blind approach. And the Food and Drug Administration typically requires that, nearly always does. But I think that's going to be re-examined to look at, there are other innovative ideas about how to create controls within the experiment that aren't quite that way, or to change people from limb to limb and so forth. So I think that's going to change over the next little while. But that's why, it's to try to ensure that the answer that comes out at the end is one that we can depend on. But it's an unsatisfactory solution.
What would some of those changes be to make it less unsatisfactory?
Oh, no, I said the current situation is unsatisfactory in the sense that people are so desperate for this. Well, I'm going to talk quickly about what I think is likely, and then I think some personal biases in here. I think the process needs to get much more in a very business-like, of saying, so risk-reward evaluations in there. And actually that's what's been done with cancer. So the idea with cancer is that people with at least severe aggressive cancers are willing to accept a much higher risk of a side effect if the reward is an effect on the cancer, right? So that's why it's kind of a little bit of an exemption with respect to these structures. But here's the kind of opposite example. I've got a new high blood pressure pill. You're going to have to take it for 30 years before we know where it works, right? Because the idea of it lowers your blood pressure, but what we're really trying to do is prevent stroke and kidney disease and heart disease 30 years from now, right? So it's going to take a long, long time before we know if that works. And what if it has a side effect 10 years out, right? So you wouldn't want to be very aggressive about switching your blood pressure medication to a new one. You'd want to be, let's wait and see on that one, right? So I'd say there we should tolerate almost no risk there for a new, we should really be sure that it's going to work before we change. You say, how about a very deadly cancer? How about this brain tumor that I'm talking about? I mean, that is a rapidly progressive, deadly tumor. Would you be willing to accept some risk with side effect? Well, yeah. I mean, you'd accept a whole lot of risk there, right? So we have it already, but it hasn't been applied to a lot of other situations except cancer. And I think it needs to be moved into essentially all diseases to be categorized as, is this patient in a disease that's going to be rapidly progressive and take something from them? In the case of Alzheimer's, it's going to take their mind from them if we don't intervene quickly. And can we tolerate more risk under those circumstances? So I think we've got to move that way conceptually. People have come up with some clever designs that let you have a group as a control for a while, and they switch over, and and you can do different limbs with different levels of the drug all at the same time. And the presumption being that if it's going to work, the higher levels will be better, at least up to a certain level. And so rather than having a group doesn't get any, you have people get different amounts. And there are a lot of different ideas along those lines. None is quite as clean as the original one, but they sort of address this idea of trying to give people hope from the outset.
One other question. Do you have anything new coming out on MS?
Do we have anything new coming out on MS? Well, we have, yes. Our clinical trials in MS, don't trust me on the exact number, but it's like 13 or 14 trials that we're running. That's about the number we usually do. Those are all done in partnership with major pharmaceutical companies. And there are several there that already have very promising results that are in the pipeline, ones where we participated in the trial, and that are in the pipeline for approval, for full approval to be used widely in patients now. To a couple in particular, they're pills rather than multiple injections. So just as far as convenience and widespread availability, there's that. And then from our basic science discoveries, one of our new scientists who just joined us from Stanford University about 2 years ago has got a really exciting new discovery that we're partnering with Merck on to look at whether, and his is actually a diagnostic that tells you when to use two existing medications. So it could be pretty fast pathway to the clinic for that. Thank you.